reading of the paper, and then I'm going to go into some examples, which we might question as examples, but they were gathered anonymously by a colleague of mine. All right, redux, bring back, linked to the Latin reduce, which had a positive meaning of restore until the 16th or 17th century, when it can mean to diminish. It seems like a clear instance of the antithetical meaning of primal words, but which sense then of redux, or both of them perhaps? In my very classical Freudian training, masturbation fantasies was a trope, it was a joke, and it was a point of utmost seriousness. The myth is that if until you fully unearthed, deconstructed, and analyzed a patient's masturbation fantasy, their treatment is incomplete. In fact, the idea is that this fantasy runs so deep that it structures their entire life, the partners or jobs they choose, how they love or fail and succeed in work, and certainly what gives them pleasure and what turns them off. It's as if this masturbation scene was a film silently running in the background of life, determining the playbook, grafting itself onto the future, and condensing one's entire sexual and familial history into a 30-second, 3-line script. But what else could explain the ubiquity and astounding specificity of pornography? How else to understand the tendencies towards fixation and repetition in our romantic lives? I remember a supervisor telling me in his interview to apply as a candidate to the New York Psychoanalytic Institute that he was asked if he wanted to confess his masturbation fantasy and just get on with the business of psychoanalysis. But maybe this was his fantasy of what would happen in his interview. Either way, the idea is that everything is there and it provides the material for the first session, the first transference dream, what will repeat ad nauseum until termination, and the masturbation fantasy will need to be summoned, said, and taken apart. Sometimes this is referred to together with the dissolution or deconstruction of one's Oedipus complex, or in a Lacanian vein, the traversal of fantasy. But is it really this one thing in the lockbox? What kind of an idea even is this? Of course not, and yet. I remember another supervisor telling me about Dr. X, who believed in masturbation fantasy so much that when his daughter woke him saying a man was breaking into the house, he said, "It's just your masturbation fantasy, go back to bed." Of course, a man was breaking into the house. This is, of course, a joke only psychoanalysts think is funny. But my entire class on adolescence was basically about the struggle against masturbation and the parents' reaction to the masturbation that was taking place in the family home. And I have to say that it wasn't an unhelpful viewpoint in a world of psychological explanation and unending advice that always leans on moralism, especially when it comes to the kids. So again, a joke, and yet not. Only once in my 20 years of practice did I have a clear sense of the masturbation fantasy, like a Freudian confessional right out of the gate. Straight away, this patient said that she pictured herself lying on a divan with endless line of men courting her favor. And there was sometimes one in the line who she eyed, thinking he was the one. And she anticipated his arrival to her, that she never consummated the excitement with this man, just marked his place in the chain. What was fascinating to me is the metonymy of others and the marking of what would be a gap or a break in the chain if it wasn't for the enjoyment that woke her up or kept her asleep, or at least was always there before a desire met its object. This break, or this meeting, depending on which way you want to figure it, is what was feared and in some sense desired. It was a placeholder that short circuits in the direction of enjoyment. This does, to an extent, speak to her dilemma, to how her life has played out with the objects of her interest, one after the next, while waiting for what will not arrive. Is it a masturbation fantasy about the psychoanalyst? She's on a divan. After all, she's looking for the one who will help her understand how to count. I still have this question. One last anecdote. Another teacher of mine in graduate school told me that the hardest paper of Freud's to read was his paper, A Child is Being Beaten. That it almost immediately went under repression and she had to read it now some 50 times. What she said felt true when I first read it, as if all the stages and phases, which I'll unfortunately go through, kept getting mixed up. Who was doing what to whom, what was real, what was being beaten literally out of our minds, but I was probably just sharing in her masturbation fantasy. Namely, a Freudian paper is being forgotten. All right, A Child is Being Beaten, subtitled A Contribution to the Study of the Origins of Sexual Perversion, is Freud's famously strangely titled paper on the topic of masturbation fantasies from 1919. We now know that the paper was written in part about his daughter Anna Freud, whose masturbatory beating fantasies she tried to disguise as a discussion about a case. These are the secret, incestuous, boundary-violating origins of the Freudian quest for masturbation fantasies to interrogate. Freud wrote this paper in order to correct what he was beginning to suspect was a trend in analysis where these fantasies were being thought of as a perversion, a kind of developmental failure to make it to some sort of sexual normality. Freud, in fact, says that they are common and that they are a scar or afterbirth, a residue of what inevitably fails in our passage through sexuality. In fact, these fantasies show us the main components of our sexual lives like a prism absorbing white light to then reveal to us all the gradations of color that compose it. Masturbation fantasy, at least as Freud describes it 100 years ago, contains 3 layers. The first is the memory, my father's beating a child whom I hate, he loves only me. The unconscious fantasy, I am being beaten by my father, and the conscious masturbatory fantasy, a child is being beaten, which is revealed as many children, often boys, beaten by a representative from the class of fathers, using a variety of instruments. The analyst constructs the second layer for the patient, and in doing so returns a more active I to them, for in the other scenes, the person is usually a voyeur watching from the sidelines. And importantly, the conscious layer of the masturbation fantasy, what we see is many changes are made and elements are elaborated, which are quite revealing. In the many masturbation fantasies, there's an attempt to answer 3 impossible questions which sexuality, which the child cannot understand in their sexual research, namely the vaginal orifice, the inseminating role of semen, and what is intercourse. These 3 questions point to something that will always be lacking in our knowledge, something that religion, politics, science in its own way, and different forms of morality attempt to give an answer to. We can find that what we have inherited from culture pertaining to the outlines of sex deposited into our intimate fantasies. This is what interests me because this reverses the polarity, not just the individual's most enclosed, isolated enjoyment of themselves, but the place most open to the world, where something of the symbolic world is taken inside and touches us on the levels of our body and enjoyment. Not only does it tell us what we think or have been told about sex, but more importantly, it gives us an X-ray of where we are as a society with respect to these fundamental mysteries, our relationship to guilt and the superego, what is being put in place, redux. So something is being brought back, something is being restored, but something is also potentially being diminished. We cannot diminish, however, unless we have brought it back, unless we have restored it to its place. And this seems to encompass the problem for analysis and the question of remembering or articulating what cannot be remembered or what hasn't been said. This work of bringing something back, even reducing it to its most minimal construction, speaks to something important about analysis, what Lacan and the philosopher Alain Badiou following him will call the axiomatic nature of psychoanalysis. Lacan, when returning to his seminar, The Logic of Fantasy, he calls the fantasies, he wants to speak to the fantasies' laws of transformation. He hypothesizes the place of an axiom to which every fantasy as a set of transformations can be reduced. The axiom, he says, must be read carefully, as literally as possible by the analyst. Freud's paper, A Child is Being Beaten, announces the axiom, this strange sentence without a subject. Lacan writes, no commentary, no meta-language will account for what is introduced into the world in such a formula. Nothing can either reduplicate it or explain it. The structure of the sentence is not there to be commented on, simply it shows itself. He writes, this fantasy should be something so essential in the functioning of the drive as something which only simply reminds us what I demonstrated about the drive before you, that it is traced out, that it is a sketched montage, a grammatical montage whose inversions, revisions, complexities are not ordered otherwise than by the application of diverse reversals, partial and chosen negations, and that there's no other way of making function the relationship of the I, qua being to the world, but passing through this grammatical structure, which is nothing other than the essence of the id. It's an incredible reworking of Freud's notion of the id, not just as a montage of the drive but the negative attempts to make function a semblance of an I. Actually, when I read this, sometimes I think he's almost like quasi-Jungian. This id-dominated fantasy props the subject up. It retains a quality of alienation, acting like a foreign body closed off and subjecting the contours of the symptom to an overdetermination of movements. But this is what analysis reads: the force of this axiomatic sentence, the grammar of a subject's fantasy, the meme of me. Returning to Freud, masturbation fantasies are an attempt by the patient, him or herself, to discover something of their history through the medium of fantasy. And this is why the question of the phantasm, as linked to the logic of psychoanalysis, is so close to the work of psychoanalysis itself and the unraveling of the symptom. I mean, you could almost interchange these two. If a signifier can never signify itself, having to enter into the chain of signifiers, there's a difficulty in ever saying I. We follow the drive to find this point of disjunction in relationship to the I, and we nevertheless say I. The montage of perverse scenarios tells us something about the missing status of the subject. At least in the classical Freudian fantasy, for girls, the masochistic fantasy is that a boy or a series of boys are being beaten by a representative from the class of fathers, teachers, police, etc., while they watch. For boys, the fantasy is that the boy himself is being beaten by his mother or a mother substitute. The girl not only changes her sex, but becomes an absent voyeur while the boy gets to remain himself. She is beaten by a figure of transferential authority marked by metonymy, whereas submitting to a male figure of authority is too threatening for the boy, so he makes a regressive substitution with his mother or mother figure in the father's place, masking his Oedipal excitement with the mother and victory over the father. Dorian later makes this very brilliant point in his paper in Freud's footnotes that we ought to think of the difference between a representative and a substitute. But he doesn't do it. Pushing this, we see in the fantasy an attempt to answer for the three missing signifiers in the breakdown of knowledge in relationship to sex: sexual act, woman, and authority, or what Freud named the incomprehension of the child concerning intercourse, the vaginal orifice, and the inseminating role of semen. But we have to remember axiomatically that Lacan translates these into the axioms that there is no sexual relationship. In the fantasy, this lack is substituted by the act of beating, pointing not to some desire to be beaten, but an attempt to signify this missing relationship. The woman does not exist. Once again, this lack is covered over in there only being boys, or there being the position of an onlooker, or being a mother. Certainly an important feminist truth. Finally, Lacan says there is no other of the other. His last axiom: there is no metaposition or ultimate authority that can be assumed. There is no urtext. But what we see in the fantasy is that there's only an infinite metonymic series of father representatives, or the phallic mother substitute, who attempts to stand in this place. So one might say that the masochistic phantasm of Freud's patients, read in this way, anticipates the axioms of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Lacan attempts to shift the force of negation, so important to Freud, onto his impossibles. And in any of these examples, the truth of what is missing or always already lost is there, beckoning to the subject for recognition. Lacan actually calls this, oddly to my ear, comprehension, which he says is embodied by the choice in which the I is constituted by the fact that I precisely comes in reserve, as I might say, as a negative curtailing, écornage, in the grammatical structure. The word écornage is interesting, for it not only means to cut something short, but literally is the word for dehorning a bull, destroying the object by taking away a part, while at the same time transforming it into the mark of its absence. The work of fantasy has this effect, the curtailing of its enclosure, by putting the I there, making it signify itself or speak itself out loud to another, which is what transforms the subject. The I, then, is the most condensed version of the grammatical logic of the phantasm and the most commonly used pronoun. Every time an I is uttered, an I is assumed to be there to sustain or substantialize it, a fantasy is being articulated. Here's where we can begin to turn the question of the masturbation phantasm of the I outwards. A child is being beaten can and perhaps should be read like an elaboration of Freud's mass psychology or group psychology and the analysis of the ego. And this feels important today. The work, as we have seen, is the clinical work of taking apart the I in the direction of a multiplicity of figures that is the phantasm, its endlessly shifting locus, objects, people, libidinal intensities, but also placing a grammatical I as agent in this mess, whose mass psychology is also a massification of excitation. Placing this I there forces a kind of dissolution, écornage, diminishing, and this seems to follow closely the spontaneous undoing sought in the examples of mass psychology, as well as looked for in the question of mourning, which seems to suddenly evaporate at a certain moment. This actually came up yesterday in the panel with Christopher Meyer and Annie Rogers in a way that fascinated me, thinking about the question of mourning in both psychotic treatments and neurotic treatments. And I was asking them about the way in which they think about these treatments and that they come together at a certain point. They think they're both driven towards the work of mourning. And Annie Rogers said that what interests her in the difference is that in psychosis, it comes quickly and it ends quickly. Whereas obviously in neurotic treatments, it's a long drawn out mourning process. But this question of something that can fall so quickly, something that can evaporate, which is both the question of what happens with the phantasm, with this moment in which you place the I there and it dissolves it, but also, of course, what Freud says about mourning in mass psychology, right? The mass forms and disperses, and then in mourning, something seems to shift that just brings the work to a close. So interestingly, if we think of the group psychology text, the mass psychology text, from the angle of identification, there really is no identification. And this seems to rub up against the ways in which we're reading the masturbation fantasies as simply, well, one of the classical ways of thinking about the masturbation fantasy is that it's simply identification with the aggressor. That's part of it, right? It's part of the mass of identifications, but it's only one amongst many. And unfortunately, it's one that covers over the more important I, the masochistic one of being beaten, or of being not the subject, but the object, the body, the site of excitement. So classically, the sort of focus on identification with the aggressor, I think, has left out this other part of the place where the I is pronounced, because it's not pronounced there. That's where it's being pronounced in the fantasy. It needs to be pronounced somewhere else. So what is important is that while there is no identification, no I, that doesn't mean that the psychoanalysis doesn't pronounce upon this impossibility and place responsibility there with the one who speaks to them. Freud reads 3 moments of locution in this I. The first locution, as you will remember, presents itself as a memory where the father beats a sibling or hated rival, which indicates love of the subject, what Lacan calls an ancillary subject who is necessary for a first articulation of subjective structure. This is a structure that he says is properly 3, me, the other, the father, where the locution has a location in an intersubjective structure of looking, knowing, coveting what is happening to the other. In a second locution, I am being beaten by my father, this 3 is reduced to 2, and excludes any other relation, even of articulation, except the action of an agent, the beating. Nevertheless, this action begins to highlight the place of an I different from the me, of a me versus them. But at the same time that this agency is being highlighted, it is undergirded by the most extreme ambiguity, including how much anyone is participating in the action, either of assaulting or being assaulted. And this is the essence of duality, of an either or, of sadomasochism, or as Freud says, not clearly sexual, not in itself sadistic, but yet the stuff from which both will later come. The word stuff, stoff, is matter or substance, not a third added to duality, not the one at the origin of differentiation, but the insubstantial substance of speech that is at once body, stuff. This is in fact what the beating seems to incarnate, this fleeting nature, its dual structure, its act of initiating and eclipsing an impossible bodily experience behind articulation. The I then is not given, neither by the scene or scenes, nor by the action of others, nor by the psychic mechanisms themselves. It is only given retroactively. The third stage, namely the more consciously elaborated masturbation fantasies, the real mess of the mass, is something else entirely. Lacan says it's a kind of flight. He calls it a radical desubjectivization, indexed by the sentence or image a child is being beaten. This valorization of an image in the process of indexing contains the two other stages while reducing the possibility of subjective structure. In stage 3, importantly, the subject is a pure onlooker and is, quote Lacan, burst apart, multiplying into umpteen specimens, a real mass psychology. And signifiers are reduced to an almost pure state, according to Lacan. In fact, he says he would go so far as to say that the subject is merely an I. That is to say, the very thing that always characterizes any kind of object at the limit, at the point of final reduction. To behold it, there has to be at least not always a subject, but an I, a screen upon which the subject is established. So what is allowed to emerge from an entire complex of speech, history, memory, articulated structure is nothing more than something that is entirely desubjectivized. Lacan concludes his discussion of the beating fantasies. Ultimately, it is enigmatic because it conserves the full charge, but this is a charge that is neither revealed nor constituted nor taken on board by the subject of what at the level of the other is the articulated structure in which the subject is engaged. So how do we think about this? If we are reduced to this nothing more than something, entirely desubjectivized, a mass and a fictional I at once, a full charge that's always liable to discharge, leaving what is articulated by an engaged subject to the other, then doesn't it seem necessary that someone begin to hear what is at stake, that someone has to make it speak, that someone has to reconstruct this I? Of course, this is the analyst. Who else could it be? And masturbation fantasies and psychoanalysis travel hand in hand, pun intended. But it cannot only be the analyst, can it? Because if that's the case, we're really in trouble. Is there a way to take this work beyond the confines of psychoanalysis, and how? I don't actually have an answer to this question like Darian Leader. I'm going to leave it to all of you. And I'm going to end with a little experiment that plays with the trope, the joke, and the seriousness of masturbation fantasies. So in 2015, for Apology magazine, a colleague of mine said, what's your like dream project? And I said, oh, I don't, I would love to get like a lot of masturbation fantasies and look at them. And he said, great, I'll do it. And I said, you can't do it. That's why it's the dream project. It's impossible. He said, no, I'm going to do it. And he spent 2 years trying to get masturbation fantasies. He didn't think it would take him this long. He didn't think it was going to be as hard as it was, but he managed to come up with 5. All right. Fantasy 1, straight male subject, 34 years old. I've never told anyone this before, and I doubt I'll ever ask a girl to try it with me, but one of my most frequent masturbation fantasies involves farting. It's got a few specific elements, though. First, I think about the girl, usually just a girl I know, like a random friend or coworker, but never really the person I'm dating at the time, wearing black pantyhose with holes in them, and she gets on her hands and knees in front of me with her butt stuck up in the air. And then I find a hole in the back of her pantyhose and rip it wider so that her whole backside is exposed, and I step away a bit, and she starts farting. I usually imagine really loud, crazy farts, and I imagine her laughing while she's doing it, like it's really fun for her. And the farts don't smell. The scent aspect is not included in the fantasy. I don't think I like that part. I just focus on this image of the girl with the butt in her hair surrounded by ripped black stockings. It's sad that I'll probably never explore this far curious side of myself. This is the first one I read. I got really excited because the signifier was there. So I had to believe that he worked hard to find something real. I'm farting for my mother. What is the vagina in this fantasy? The vagina is an unscented farting anus. What is authority? Authority is the instrument of exposing humiliation, but also the one who gives license to enjoy. It's a fantasy of anal expulsion. Adrian Johnson, there you go. And it's also a scene of speech. What is the sexual relationship, marriage, love, whatever? In this fantasy, the sex is organized around ripping or letting it rip, ripping the stocking, farting, going for it, full blast noise. This is an almost solitary enjoyment for the one who gets to step back and watch. I'm going to pull up these together. We're just going to go through them for fun. Fantasy number 2, straight male subject, 42 years old. I'm glad this is anonymous because I'm going to give you one that's totally baffling to me and that also feels sort of shameful, but that really gets me off whenever I think about it. It starts with picturing this girl I used to go out with a long time ago. When I was breaking up with her, I was being really mean and she was crying, and I feel guilty about this behavior now years later, so maybe that's why it's an element of shame. In real life, when this happened, she was wearing nothing but a t-shirt, white cotton panties. She's wearing that. The purely made up part is that it starts for me with her going into the bathroom and me following her. I dress her. We get in and I spend a really long time cleaning her. I can see all the details, especially the soap bubbles. I spend time cleaning her tits, her ass. And I'm cleaning, she keeps crying. I picture her face with tears running down, and just that image itself is enough. I know it's fucked up of me, but it really gets me off. Washed by my mother. What does the subject associate with women? Crying, hurt, helpless, by inference, dirty. Includes a question about the mother. What is the role of semen? Father is the contradiction of being both the one to inflict pain, also the one washing away one's sin. What is the sexual relationship? Anal sadism is the transformation of injury into purity or guilt into virtue, to be clean as a whistle, to live a clean life, to have a good, clean fight. I still mainly masturbate to my brain rather than to porn, unless I use a magic wand. It happens too fast. But yeah, when I use my hand, I come up with little movies. One that I've gone to a few times involves me and my girlfriend having sex for a room full of older women who are watching us. The room usually looks kind of classic college classroom. So funny, the university. Like an Ivy League place. The women watching us are all fully dressed. They're also kind of severe, like they aren't touching themselves. They're more like clinical observers, and they surround us. We're in the middle of the room. In the fantasy, the sex between my girlfriend and I is usually pretty basic, but it's mutual, playing with each other, but it's really tender, like lots of kissing and moaning. So it's like we're not fucking with these women watching us, we're making love. I thought this one was so good. What are women and their desire? There is no sexual woman. There are severe school moms or little girls playing and being tender. What is the father? The father is an older female college professor with a clinical gaze, Ivy League. What is the sexual relationship? Observing and by inference, judging, grading, teaching. Not fucking, but making love, which means kissing, touching, moaning, and the display of tenderness to the woman who can't understand it. I would name this ambiguity, who is teaching whom? Which is interesting in light of what's happening in the university these days. I mean, if you think about it with the question of the what the anger of the kids is in terms of what's supposed to happen in the classroom. Gay male, subject, 28 years old. These terms feel retrograde to me, but I guess I'm what you would call a top. I also tend to date guys who are smaller and swisher. I don't really like being with men who have bigger muscles. I've never been closeted, and I've always been this way in terms of preference. I also don't really jerk off without the use of porn anymore. It's just faster, easier. Darian Leader, when I presented this paper at CFAR, was really interested in the fact that there's references in the telling of the masturbation fantasy to the masturbation fantasy that's not a masturbation fantasy, right? Either the use of porn or the use of an instrument that makes it not the story that's articulated, thinking of this question of desubjectivization. But when I was younger, and it was still even a little bit of a struggle to get to look at some porn, I would fantasize. One of the most frequent fantasies I would jerk off to was me being very submissive and passed around by a group of bigger guys, pretty much me getting gang banged. And I remember thinking about the struggle, a kind of weak struggle, and these fantasy guys holding me down and not letting me move and kind of treating me like a piece of meat. Like I wouldn't imagine them talking to me or even looking at me, but more important, amongst themselves, joking about me and egging each other on while they were fucking me. I've never done anything remotely like this. I doubt I ever will. It's not like something I secretly want to do, but I'm resisting. It's just a thing I used to come up with. It feels totally out of character. There's no woman evident, but she's there in the hidden figure of the bottom, who's treated like a piece of meat, a pure object. Whereas the father is a horde of men who egg each other on, talk amongst themselves, and help one another to hold the other down. What is the sexual relationship? It's the division between tops and bottoms, being those allowed to speak and joke and fuck, but who are an indistinguishable crowd, and the one who is weak, passed around, held down, and enjoyed. I would characterize this as a question: which is worse, to be one or one of the gang? To be the one or one of the gang? Last one. This was the hardest one to get, obviously, straight female fantasy. Not obviously, but I said you gotta try harder. It's been 2 years already. I said, okay. So this is the straight female fantasy 31. This is a reversible sweater of a masturbation fantasy, and both fits are equally appealing. I get off thinking about receiving or giving a sensual massage. It goes like this: I'm lying on a table face down, nude. There's nothing notable about the environment. It's a standard massage room. A man enters and begins rubbing my shoulders, my back, the way massage therapists do. Sometimes I imagine the man is a person I know. Sometimes he's anonymous or faceless. That part doesn't really matter to me, but it feels great. Then he starts to work my legs, my feet, my butt, my thighs, even stroking near and near my vagina. Finally, he reaches it, rubs it, fingers me. I can't hold back, and then I beg. It could also go like this: I'm the one giving the massage. The outcome is essentially the same. I tease and I touch until we have sex. The anticipation and slowly building to sex is what makes this extra arousing. The aching, longing, gut-fluttering feeling. The fantasy more or less ends after the P and V. I had never heard that before. Penetration begins. It's not really about that for me. That's what's interesting. The fantasy was inspired by watching massage parlor porn. The first time I saw it, I felt it was a rare instance of a woman experiencing real sensuality in porn instead of being ram-fucked like an animal. I enjoy putting myself in the position of the masseuse because I totally get off on giving pleasure to my partners. In part, I think it stems from social conditioning, the importance of the male orgasm. Not that I don't believe in an equal exchange. I do. Which is why this fantasy works so well. So earnest and nice. I'm being massaged by my father. So what are women? Women are giving and receiving pleasure. They're begging, they're teasing, they're aching and longing, but they're not being ram-fucked like animals. The father is a sensual masseur, but importantly, he can take being teased and he can wait. There's a disjunction between intercourse as penetration and sensuality. They seem not to fit together. Penetration means the end, not the beginning, and the closest one gets to a penis is the finger or hand, hence the massage. Sensuality promises for her a more equal exchange, a reversal of roles, a play of tension, and an ability to attend to the other's pleasure. But nevertheless, in this, is there a sheer negation of the penis? And one might suspect that this is the hidden aspect of the fantasy. In conclusion, these fantasies seem to point to us being just as guilty. I don't know, everyone wants to talk about the new age that we're in, but there's something of very classical guilt for sexuality. And that we're as guilty as we always have been. No one engages directly in the act. The outlines of guilt, judgment, punishment, and sin are everywhere. The question of fathers and authority no longer seems to be the simple figure of patriarchal law. Sure, that's true. But instead of the perhaps expected absence of the law, we find a law that can be obscene, contradictory, that gives paradoxical commands, or shows up in the guise of phallic domineering women, or unruly crowd. The scenes feel like scenes trying to screen the fact of being tortured by language, which rips, which tears, which teaches, which judges, which eggs, and which begs. On the side of action, sex isn't beating, as it is in the Freud fantasies, but we find farting, washing, teaching, passing, holding, massaging, touching, which is fine. Eros is a many-headed beast, but don't the infantile aspects of it strike you so powerfully? Aren't these such figures for the intimacies of childhood? Washing, farting, teaching, passing, holding, massaging. While the search for sensuality is infinitely important, the enigma of sex and gender and love and authority lead to a pull towards infantile anxiety, such that while there's an attempt to image a greater symmetry between the sexes, and certainly the mother more readily appears, there is nevertheless just as much debasement, sadomasochism, moralizing surrounding shame and guilt, if not more and more varied. What was perhaps most striking to me was the powerful negation of the presence of genitals, of sex as penetration or fucking, which is having a very difficult time appearing. It always does. But there isn't even a phallic instrument for beating. There's the one who can hurt and who has to redeem himself, but again, only as the background of the fantasy, a backstory, or the unruly crowd, but it's important that it is not one. The teacher's severe Ivy League judgment, but again forced into the background since she merely watches. The massage man is someone who does not, who holds back, but perhaps could. The fleeting phallus used to be the fleeting place of the subject. Is this why the phallus or phallic sexuality is reappearing in reality in the form of authoritarian and new forms of misogyny? Perhaps. Is this why everything at the moment is a question about masculinity, toxic masculinity? Perhaps. Is this why we are in all kinds of new forms of sex panic? Perhaps. This, while we also have a radical decline in the interest in sex. Everyone's panda theory. I learned this too. That's what you call it, why the pandas aren't having sex. In any case, I would say gain some, lose some. And as for masturbation fantasies, what better place is there to witness our Faustian bargains than in their interstices? Thank you very much.